This is copy number 1 in a limited edition of none. This book does not exist. You have never seen it. These are the words that begin one of the most elusive pieces of SpongeBob lost media that's ever existed, and one that so few people have ever even seen, it could be considered the holy grail of all SpongeBob lost media. In fact, when you think of the holy grails of SpongeBob lost media, what comes to mind? Maybe it's something involving the show's early production, like the original audio that was recorded for the pilot, while the character still used his original name, SpongeBoy. Or maybe the uncensored audio from the episode Sailor Mouth, where the characters swear on the actual recording, since it would be edited out for the episode anyway. While Sailor Mouth has become quite a desired piece of SpongeBob lost media to the fans, its mere existence goes hand in hand with a larger piece of SpongeBob lore, that there once existed some kind of adult version of the show. For years, ever since the show first gained popularity, there have been rumors that SpongeBob was originally pitched to Adult Swim instead of Nickelodeon, or that an adult party cartoon iteration, similar to Ren and Stimpy, was being made for Spike TV. But in every one of these cases, there was no evidence to support the claims, with all trails leading back to forum posts from people claiming their relatives work at these networks and heard about it from there. So based on this knowledge, it would be understandable to believe that no such adult version of SpongeBob ever existed. Now, what if I told you that an adult version of SpongeBob does exist? And no, not in some fan-related way that is not directly connected to the show, but rather in an official capacity, by the people that had a hand in making the cartoon while they were within the walls of Nickelodeon, that as far as I'm aware, nobody outside of production has ever seen or documented. However, our story does not begin at Nickelodeon where you might expect, and not with some kind of secret lead or connection, but rather, it begins with an interview conducted by a cartoon magazine called Hogan's Alley, discussing the oral history of SpongeBob SquarePants from over a decade after the show first began. It's a very extensive interview that features many different aspects of the show from many different points of view, told by the people who helped create it. In a segment headlined, "We all loved what we were making," this is even more apparent, as the crew recollect the joy it was in being part of SpongeBob's world, despite their low wages and non-stop work schedule at the time. And it's in this fact that you could maybe say they had a little too much fun, and this is where the holy grail of SpongeBob lost media is mentioned for the very first time. It's the only place on the entire internet where it's mentioned, and was openly available for the public to find and read for all these years. Kent Osborne mentioned a bit of behind-the-scenes content during the time working on the show, stating, "At the end of the season, all the storyboard artists would do these hilarious, crude drawings of SpongeBob on post-it notes just to make everyone else laugh, and these drawings would go on the back of the door, because if the door was open, no one would see them. Sam Henderson took all of these post-its and made them into a book and gave a copy to everybody. The name of the book was Behind Closed Doors." In all the years I've spent searching for lost media and covering SpongeBob topics specifically, I have never even heard about this Behind Closed Doors book before, and apparently neither had anyone else online, because it's never been discussed or been in the public eye before. The interview itself is so large, you'd have to know what you were looking for to even find it in the first place. But even if you had known about it and found this interview, there's nothing from the book that is shown or discussed here. There's only that mention of hilarious crude drawings of the SpongeBob characters done by the artists who worked on the show, and later on, a mention that everyone is credited with anagrams rather than their real names in case the book fell into the wrong hands. It sounds like something that any fan of the show would love to see, but with it being an internal, crew-only product that hasn't even been mentioned since this interview, it's pretty unlikely to ever be shared. So you might be wondering how I came across this article in the first place, and that takes us to an email I received from an anonymous source that told me they had a piece of SpongeBob lost media better than the uncensored Sailor Mouth audio, which is a pretty tall order to fill, considering how desired that audio is to the fans. But they were absolutely not wrong, and went on to describe what they had in their possession, stating that they could not disclose the details on how they specifically acquired it, but proceeded to tell me of their younger days hanging around the old Nickelodeon Studios building, and through a series of bizarre events, as they called it, were given a gift that almost no one in the world has ever seen. This was a copy of Behind Closed Doors. Admittedly, I had not heard about this topic or the article in question until receiving the email from the source, and apparently the source had forgotten about the topic too, mentioning they let the collection gather dust in their attic for more than a decade, until having come across that article recently and dug it out as a response. But what that Hogan magazine article failed to disclose is what exactly the content was contained within the book, aside from being hilarious and crude. And then, I was sent the first photo of the book as proof that it was real, which gave me a really good idea of what hilarious and crude really meant. The shortened title of the book is Behind Closed Doors, as stated in the interview, but its full title is called Behind Closed Doors: Horrible, Filthy, Vile, Disgusting, Inappropriate, Off-Model Drawings by the crew of a popular cartoon show. This is the cover of the book, and along with the text on it, we are greeted by artwork of SpongeBob, Patrick, and Mr. Krabs engaged in some group activity, followed by a spread of artwork behind it, consisting of 28 pages and hundreds of drawings by my source's estimate. And if you look closely at these pages, you can make out what some of the characters and scenarios are, most of which are too graphic for this video. While this is very shocking to see right off the bat, what's truly important to note within these materials is the anagram of Kent Osborne appearing in the book, just as it's stated in the Hogan's Alley article, proving that these materials are the real deal, and this is only a small portion of the book's content. While I was not sent over the entire collection, and I don't know what they plan on doing with the full collection, what was unearthed to me is still mind-blowing when you consider the characters and how they're depicted here. None of these drawings can be shown uncensored on YouTube, but even with their censorship, it's still pretty easy to tell what's going on, so we'll take a closer look at each of them. One of the most common themes depicted in these pieces is simply drawing characters with realistic body parts that are never seen in the show, with a couple of the more harmless ones simply being SpongeBob grabbing himself in a shocking sort of way, as seen on the back cover. It features 3 different poses of him stretching himself, followed by the depiction of Squidward with SpongeBob nude on a different page. SpongeBob has a somewhat realistic-looking face and is sort of curled up on the ground, while Squidward is standing and sports an entire head that was changed to what's supposed to be on his groin, but instead there's nothing else there in the picture. Then, there are a couple other images that push this adult boundary even further. One that even includes text and descriptions of the characters that look much closer to how they appear in the cartoon. Squidward is seen asking nude SpongeBob, "How do you make it sing like that?" and points to his private parts, to which SpongeBob responds, "It only sings around you, Squidward." The other drawing that pushes boundaries is the most interesting one of the set so far, and uses a storyboard sheet for the SpongeBob Got Milk print ad. This was an ad campaign that promoted drinking milk and was referenced heavily in the lost media search that occurred in trying to find a copy of the animated commercial. While there is no adult animated commercial, it certainly exists as this drawing, which turns the scene from SpongeBob drinking milk, getting a milk mustache, and having it be absorbed, into Patrick spraying SpongeBob inappropriately, it falling on his lips, and then getting absorbed like the milk in the real ad. Next are perhaps the 2 most explicit of all, with the first one showing a freaked out SpongeBob on the ground with Mr. Krabs, performing what could be considered a favor for him, and the second one seemingly being a parody scene of an actual episode from the show. This is supposed to be from Squilliam Returns, for the fact that there's text stating, "SpongeBob makes a pinching motion," and "If you need anything else, just call," taken from the episode. Squidward appears to be dressed in his formal wear, but SpongeBob is seen completely naked and is taking aim at Squidward's behind. And finally is sort of an outlier when it comes to content shown. It's a page that features Mr. Krabs using the bathroom in an over-exaggerated way, with text at the bottom that reads, "And now for the chaser," which is a line spoken in the final episode of Plankton's Army. My source informs me that this storyboard was actually submitted for animation, likely as a joke, and was rejected. But the line itself was left in the episode, and was allegedly a reference to this art. Interestingly, it appears as though this page was copied on official storyboard paper, but was not drawn directly on it, unlike some of the other pieces from this collection. Curious about the various quality and condition of each page, I asked if these pieces were copied from a real book, or if every book only existed as photocopies, but they didn't know. They mentioned that their copy was made from one that was held together in a spiral notebook, and was one of the originals, rather than being a third, fourth, or fifth printing. I did notice the back page says it's the second printing, so if all these pages came from the same run, then it would seem likely. Though it's also unclear how many copies exist in the first place. However, even for how inappropriate or offensive these drawings might seem on the surface, there is something else that should be considered when looking at them all these years later. It's no secret that Nickelodeon has been the subject of a lot of workplace controversies over the years, with John Kay and Dan Schneider being the poster boys for that kind of behavior. But that's not to say these were the only examples of the dark work culture that surrounded the Nickelodeon crew members at the time. It's reasonable to conclude that these drawings were simply a cathartic response to that kind of work environment. For example, the picture of SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs could be considered a response to the rumors of performing sexual acts for advancement in the company, and SpongeBob saying to Squidward "it only sings around you" could be addressing the rumors that SpongeBob was gay. A huge baseless controversy that the crew of the show had gone on record responding to many times. Kaz Propylenis, a cartoonist on the show, also stated in the Hogan's Alley interview that some board guys would actually lock their doors as the tours came around. It was better that the kids not step into some offices, as they were decorated with post-it drawings of the SpongeBob characters cavorting in the most disgusting, depraved, sexual scenarios that only the sick minds of jaded cartoonists could vomit up, further adding evidence to the idea of the awful work culture of Nickelodeon Studios at the time, and how it affected the people working on these cartoons. But as someone who wasn't there myself, this is only my conclusion, and though my source was there during some of these controversial times, they only heard stories secondhand. However, it's up to you to draw your own conclusions about the intention or messages behind these drawings. Kent Osborne described them as hilarious and crude in that interview from 11 years ago. And my source also believes the drawings are mostly in good fun, that they illustrate the brilliance of the team who was at the top of their game at the time, just not in a way intended for the show's main audience. However, that's not to say the source does feel that some of the drawings cross the line in a way that feels uncomfortable, especially in some of the other content from the collection. There is no way to know which pieces were drawn by which artists, as nearly a dozen of them contributed to it, but I was informed that one of the drawings depicts 1940s war imagery that uses company logos, and another that shows actual harm to characters, that goes way beyond the simple gross-out factor. I was also informed by my source that their book, despite all its content, is likely not a complete version of all the drawings that were made for it. Specifically, they mentioned having requested certain pages be left out for its distasteful content, but it's also believed that the person who made my source's copy intentionally left some content out due to how objectionable it was. Unfortunately, the creation of each copy remains unclear, and there is no way to verify exactly how much content was in the original master, or was put into each copy that was made. In fact, my source's copy was given to them under the impression that it was one of the only ones that existed, and was going to be disposed of, apparently to get rid of it before the new management came in at the time. We know from the Hogan's Alley interview, however, that many copies were made, leading to the belief that all existing copies were made from an original source book, and that book was kept locked in a desk and contained some of the original art, as my source could verify. But even with this knowledge and possibility of more being out there, there's no way to tell if the other copies are still in existence, or would ever even be released by their owners. This one could be the only one that was archived, and I'm thankful we were able to even see a small portion of its content that otherwise would have continued to be forgotten about. They also heard rumors from back then about other Nickelodeon shows having similar behind closed doors books, but there's no evidence to suggest that's true, and could have been misinformation that was passed around over the years, as this project seems to have not been spoken of. In my opinion, the takeaway from Behind Closed Doors is not the fact that it simply exists for shock value, but the fact that it exists as a remnant of a studio that has been plagued with controversy even in the best of content that's been produced for us. The source even mentioned that after having visited the studio, in the years following the creation of these drawings, the atmosphere surrounding them had changed to fit more of a PTSD and war story way. So it seems like there's a reason for why these drawings exist and were made in the first place, which are important to understand and think about, even though they are without a doubt unbelievable to see. It's such a huge piece of lost media that, given this age of archival, is an important piece to have, and acts as a way to look back on an older iteration of the brand that hopefully doesn't exist anymore. Without a doubt, becoming one of the most legendary pieces of lost media I've ever seen. It feels like it shouldn't exist at all, yet it does, and feeds into that fascination of seeing SpongeBob in more adult ways. And now we actually have that drawn by the real artists, real people, on some official storyboard paper, used in the creation of one of the most popular cartoons of all time. Behind Closed Doors represents much more than the artwork itself, for both lost media preservation and animation history. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to check out some of my other lost media videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Finn.